They laughed when she said she wanted to play chess for food, laughed so hard that crystal glasses rattled on tables beneath chandeliers. To them, she was just another street rat, a hungry 12-year-old with torn sleeves and scuffed sneakers. But when Lila Monroe pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Grandview Chess Club on that freezing December night, she carried more than hunger. She carried a secret that would shatter the certainty of everyone in that room, a gift sharp enough to cut through 50 years of silence, and a courage that would make them question everything they believed about genius, class, and who deserved to sit at their polished walnut tables. The wind had been howling down Madison Avenue like an invisible beast when she made up her mind. Lila was curled up in the alcove of a shuttered bakery, her cardboard sign limp against the wet pavement. Hungry. Any help. God bless. The words were smudged, the marker nearly washed away by sleet, but she kept it folded carefully, as if it were something sacred. Her jacket, once pink, but now the color of winter dust, was too big for her bony frame. The zipper was broken, held shut by 2 safety pins she had scavenged from the subway floor. Her breath made clouds in the air, and the ache in her stomach had sharpened into something that felt almost like clarity. Across the street glowed a building she had stared at for weeks but never dared approach. The Grandview Chess Club looked like it belonged to another century, with tall arched windows spilling golden light onto the snow-patched sidewalk, chandeliers glittering inside like constellations. She could see men in dark suits bending over boards, women in pearls watching with cool interest, and she thought of her grandmother's voice as if it were a move whispered in her ear. The queen is the most powerful piece, baby girl, and someday, so will you be. Rosa Monroe had taught her chess on a battered set in the shelter where they once lived, teaching her to see the board as a world where logic reigned and even a pawn could fight its way across to become a queen. But Rosa had been gone for 2 years, taken by cancer, and every foster home since had made Lila feel smaller. Tonight she was done waiting for someone else to move the pieces. She stood, brushed the slush from her jacket, folded the sign, and crossed the street. The brass handle was so cold it burned her palm. For a moment she saw her reflection in the glass, a girl with hollow cheeks, cap pulled low, eyes too old for 12. And then she pushed. Warmth hit her face like a wave. The lobby smelled of leather chairs and expensive cigars, of polished wood that glowed under chandelier light. Persian rugs muffled her steps. For a breathless moment, she just stood there, taking it in, the oil paintings in gilt frames, the gleam of crystal decanters, the faint music of chess pieces tapping boards in the next room. Then the silence came. Every head turned. Conversations stopped. At the nearest table, a man in a navy suit, Edward Crane, hedge fund royalty with cufflinks that caught the light, set down his glass and stared at her as though she had dragged in the night air itself. Beside him, Beatrice Langford, queen of every charity gala in the city, adjusted her pearl necklace and murmured just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Security?" The guard appeared at once, a tall man in black whose shoes clicked sharply against the marble. "This is a private club," he said, his tone clipped and cold. "You need to leave." Lila's pulse hammered, but she did not back away. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I just want to play chess. If I win, you give me food. If I lose, I'll leave right away, I promise." For a long second, there was only the hush of expensive fabrics shifting. Then the laughter began, brittle, mocking, rising like the sound of ice breaking on a river. "She wants to play for food," Edward said, smiling thinly. "What is this, a medieval tavern?" Beatrice's laugh was like breaking glass. "Before she steals the silverware, I hope." Someone in the back muttered about calling the police. Lila's face burned, but she held her ground. "I'm good at chess," she said. Edward arched one eyebrow. Good at chess? Do you even know how the pieces move? I know the French defense, the King's Indian, and the Sicilian, she answered quietly. And you? Her eyes locked on his. Just lost your rook 3 moves ago because you pushed the wrong pawn. The laughter faltered. Edward turned to look at his board. She was right. At the far end of the hall, Richard Whitmore, the club's president, rose from his chair. He had the look of a general about to issue an order, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes sharp as a rook's edge. A step behind him stood Eleanor Whitmore, his wife and a trustee of the club's youth scholarship fund, her expression unreadable. Interesting, Richard said. Mr. Crane, perhaps you'd like to test our visitor. 1 quick game, 5 minutes. When you win, and you will, she leaves and never returns. Edward smirked, stung but eager to reclaim his dignity. With pleasure. The board was cleared and reset. Members gathered close until they formed a human ring, their faces glowing under the chandeliers. Lila sat, legs barely reaching the carpet, fingers trembling only once before she moved her king's pawn forward 2 squares. E4. Ladies first, Edward said with mockery curling his lips. But Lila did not flinch. She had already heard her grandmother's whisper in her mind, "Fortune favors the bold, baby girl." And on that cold December night, in a room filled with people who wanted her gone, Lila Monroe was about to play the opening move that would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire Grandview Chess Club. Edward Crane sank into the leather chair opposite her, the sound low and final, like the lid of a coffin closing. The circle of members tightened around the table until it felt like the air itself was closing in. The scent of expensive perfume and cigars hung thick in the room, a cloud of judgment. Lila's heart thudded in her chest like a war drum, but her small hands gripped the edge of the table and did not tremble. Edward answered with E5, a move played with the lazy arrogance of a man who had crushed dozens of challengers here before. A ripple of amusement moved through the circle. Lila didn't answer, not with words, but with a knight leaping to NF3, a move so natural it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. The early laughter began to fade as the game unfolded. Edward smirked, rolling his wrist as he played move after move, but Lila saw what he didn't, a hairline crack in the wall of his defense. She pushed her D-pawn, a sharp sound, like a blade slicing paper. A murmur rose. Edward captured XD4, feigning nonchalance. Lila's knight recaptured NXD4, taking control of the center. The circle pressed closer, bodies leaning in, their collective breath warming the air like a storm about to break. "She's just copying," someone whispered. "Don't let it rattle you, Edward." But Edward's breathing had changed, because the knight hadn't just taken a pawn, it had opened a path. Lila's queen glided into the center, her dark eyes never leaving the board. The room went still. A few of the older members frowned. They'd seen this kind of coordination before, but not from a street child and not this fast. Edward tried to shake her with a bishop pin, but Lila's pieces seemed to come alive all at once, working together as though some invisible conductor had raised a baton. 1, 2, 3 moves later, and the silence turned into a collective intake of breath. "Check," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it struck the room like a bell. Edward had only one legal move. He made it, his hand unsteady. Lila slid her rook forward, calm as dawn. Another check. Sweat gathered at Edward's hairline. He stumbled into one last square, and Lila's queen came down with quiet finality. Checkmate. No one laughed. Edward sat frozen, staring at the board as though sheer willpower might undo what had just happened. The room erupted in whispers. 15 moves. She mated him in 15 moves. This isn't possible. Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the room, smooth and cold as glass. Enough! The girl won. We keep our word. Keep our word? Beatrice Langford hissed, pearls trembling at her throat. We just let a vagrant humiliate one of our own. If this gets out, what do you think it will do to this club's reputation? The reputation of this club, Richard said slowly, is that we face worthy opponents. And tonight, we have found one, whether we wanted to or not. But Lila saw it, Edward leaning toward Beatrice, whispering something behind his hand. Heads nodded. The laughter was gone now, replaced by something colder. They weren't just humiliated, they were afraid. When a silver tray was brought to her with a loaf of bread and a steaming bowl of soup, Lila felt every pair of eyes on her. The food was warm, but the looks that followed her were colder than the winter night outside. In the corner, she heard fragments of words float like smoke. Background check. Records. We can't just let her walk out of here. A chill ran down her spine. Rosa's voice echoed in her memory. Chess isn't just about attacking, baby girl. It's about seeing the threat before anyone else does. Tonight, she had won a game. But somewhere in this room, a much larger, much darker game had just begun, and Lila Monroe had just made her first move. The dining room had grown quiet, almost ceremonial, by the time Lila finished her last bite of bread. The soup had warmed her chest, but it could not melt the feeling that had gathered like frost along her spine. Every glance, every whisper, every half-suppressed laugh she'd endured still clung to her skin. She placed the silver spoon down as Rosa had once taught her, neatly, with dignity, and slid out of the chair. The main hall was nearly empty. The members had drifted away in pairs and trios, murmuring in low voices, some casting glances back at the girl who had just dismantled Edward Crane in 15 moves. To them, she was still not fully real, not one of them, more apparition than opponent. Snow was falling hard outside, thick white curtains beyond the tall windows. The night looked softer through that veil, but the wind howled like something alive. Lila's cardboard sign was tucked under her arm now. It no longer felt like a plea, but like a relic, a reminder of the hunger that had driven her through those heavy oak doors. Hunger had brought her here, but something else would keep her here. Something sharper than hunger, something closer to defiance. A sound broke the silence, a soft, decisive click of a latch. Lila froze. Down the corridor, past the hall of oil portraits, a door had just closed. Through the narrow space between frame and floor, light spilled into the dim hallway. Voices rose, muted but urgent. She crept closer, her sneakers soundless on the thick Persian rug. Too dangerous, a woman's voice hissed. Beatrice Langford, unmistakable, the pearls always rattling softly against her throat when she spoke. She's 12, Victor Hemsley replied. Not the president, but the club's most venerable elder, a man whose calm could cut. His voice carried a tension that undercut the words. We can't treat this like... Like what? Beatrice's voice sharpened. Like what happened in 62? There was silence then. A silence so sharp it felt like the building itself was listening. Edward Crane spoke next, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, cold now. If word gets out that a Monroe is still playing, all of it comes back. The papers we buried, the matches we scrubbed from the record, the deals we made. We'll look like fools. Worse than fools. Conspirators. Lila's hand went to the wall to steady herself. Monroe. He had said Monroe. We can't risk it, Beatrice continued. Tonight was spectacle. Tomorrow order must be restored. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Victor asked, his tone measured, almost weary. We run her record, Edward said flatly. Find where she's supposed to be. A girl like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone's looking for her. We make a call, have her taken back to wherever she escaped from. And if she fights? A chair scraped. Then we make sure she doesn't come back. Ever. The words landed like a stone in Lila's stomach. The door opened suddenly. She ducked back into the shadows as Beatrice emerged, followed by Edward and Victor. Their faces were masks again, smooth, controlled, but Edward's jaw was set so hard it looked carved from marble. They walked past without seeing her. Lila stayed pressed against the wall until the last echo of their footsteps died away. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. She turned and walked quickly toward the side exit, the one the kitchen staff used. When she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a slap. Snow swirled madly beneath the street lamps, coating the steps in white. Her breath smoked in the air, each exhale quick and sharp. She stood there for a long moment, the night pressing around her, the sound of the city muffled by the storm. They were planning to erase her, just as they had erased Rosa. The thought didn't terrify her the way she expected. It burned. Rosa's voice rose in her mind, calm and steady, as though her grandmother were standing right beside her. Chess isn't just about attacking, baby girl. It's about seeing the threat before anyone else does, and deciding what you're willing to sacrifice to win. Lila began walking, each step crunching in the fresh snow. The city stretched out before her like an unmarked chessboard, every streetlight a piece waiting to be placed. She thought of the look on Edward's face when the queen came down for mate, the way Beatrice's pearls had quivered when she hissed about 62, the strange, sharp note in Victor's voice when he said too dangerous. They knew something Rosa had never told her, something they had fought to keep hidden for half a century. And if they thought they could bury her along with that secret, they were wrong. By the time she reached the library's stone steps, snow was plastered in her hair, her shoes soaked through. But she didn't feel the cold anymore. She would find the truth. About Rosa, about 62, about why this club feared the name Monroe so much. For the first time since she'd walked into that building, Lila smiled. A small, dangerous smile. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we stop playing their game and start playing mine. And she disappeared into the storm, leaving behind a trail of footprints that the snow quickly swallowed, as if the night itself were trying to erase her. Snow followed Lila all the way to the public library, clinging to her hair and eyelashes until she looked like a ghost of herself. It was nearly midnight, but the marble lions at the entrance stood eternal guard, their stone faces flecked with white. The heavy glass doors creaked as she pushed them open, and warm air smelling faintly of dust and ink wrapped around her. Most of the building was dark, but the archive room still glowed faintly with green-shaded lamps. A lone librarian glanced up as she entered. He looked surprised to see a child, soaked to the bone, her sneakers squelching against the polished floor. "Research," she said simply, clutching her damp cardboard sign to her chest like a passport. Something in her tone, or maybe in her eyes, kept him from asking questions. He pointed her toward the microfilm cabinets. The hum of the ancient machine filled the silence as Lila fed reel after reel through the reader. Newspapers flickered past like ghosts. 1960, 1961, then 1962. Headlines about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, a young Kennedy's speeches, and then, buried on page 8 of a January issue, a single column, "Local woman denied entry to state championship." Lila's breath stopped. There was no photo, just a few sentences. Rose Monroe, 21, was barred from competition due to eligibility concerns. Tournament officials declined to comment further. Her eyes narrowed. Rosa had always told her they miswrote her name. They had anglicized it on purpose, she'd said once, made Rosa into Rose, a small edit that made erasing easier. A week later, another clipping, shorter, colder. Unofficial results nullified. According to the brief note, 3 games played off-record were struck from any rating list. The players involved were unnamed. She kept digging. March, April. Then she found it. An editorial. Tradition must be preserved in our institutions. The words dripped with coded venom. When individuals outside the appropriate social and professional circles attempt to insert themselves into our venerable tournaments, the integrity of the game itself is at stake. Lila's fists tightened. Rosa hadn't just been ignored. She had been erased. Another page, a grainy photograph. A group shot of men in suits, the State Federation Board. 2 faces were unmistakable even through the decades. Edward Crane's father and Victor Hemsley, younger, but unmistakable. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just history. This was inheritance. The microfilm reel spun to its end with a dry slap. Lila sat back, her heart hammering. Everything Rosa had told her, all the lessons whispered across a shelter chessboard, suddenly blazed with new meaning. Rosa hadn't just taught her chess. She had been passing down a weapon, move by move, waiting for the day someone could finish the fight she couldn't. Somewhere behind her, a clock struck 1. She gathered the printed clippings, folded them carefully, and slipped them into her jacket pocket. Each one felt like a piece of ammunition. As she stepped back out into the storm, the city felt different, sharper, alive with threat. The streets were empty, but she had the uncanny sense she was being watched. A black car idled at the corner, its exhaust pluming white into the snow. Its headlights flared briefly, then went dark. Lila turned away, her pace quickening, every nerve on fire. By the time she reached the small room above the bakery where she sometimes slept, dawn was breaking. She spread the clippings across the floorboards and studied them until her eyes blurred. The pattern was there, not just injustice, but a deliberate purge of Rosa's name from the game she loved. She thought of Edward's voice behind that closed door. Then we make sure she doesn't come back. They wanted to silence her the same way they had silenced Rosa. But tomorrow night, the club would host its annual closed tournament, the most prestigious event of the year. The room would be full. The city's eyes would be on them. If she could win there, in front of everyone, they couldn't erase her. Not again. Lila blew out the single candle she had lit, leaving the room in darkness. Tomorrow night, she thought, setting her jaw. Tomorrow, I put them all in check. The storm had cleared by the time Lila returned to the club the next evening, but the city still glistened as though it had been scrubbed raw. Sidewalks were slick with half-melted snow, and the air had that rare, crystalline clarity that comes only after a night of fury. Her sneakers were still damp from the day before, but she no longer felt the cold. The fire burning in her chest was enough. When she pushed open the heavy oak doors, the room went quiet. Not mocking quiet this time, but sharp, expectant. A dozen heads turned. The polished floor reflected the chandeliers like a frozen lake. Edward Crane was waiting by the hearth, a glass of amber whiskey in hand, his profile carved against the firelight. Beatrice Langford stood near him, pearls gleaming, her expression unreadable. Victor Hemsley was there too, leaning on his cane as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. At the far end of the hall, seated at the main table, was Richard Whitmore, the club president. Eleanor stood slightly behind him, hands clasped, her face thoughtful. "You came back," Richard said at last, his voice smooth but carrying weight. "You expected me not to?" A faint smile curved his lips. We expected you to think very carefully before you did. Lila stood straighter. I thought carefully. I came anyway. A murmur rippled through the room, like wind through a field of glass. Richard set down his glass and gestured to a chair. Sit. Lila remained standing. Very well, he said, something like respect flickering in his gaze. Miss Monroe, tonight is the opening of our Winter Invitational, the most exclusive tournament of the year. It is not open to the public, not open to guests, not even to most of our members. Only the strongest players sit at these tables. Edward Crane's mouth twitched, as if suppressing a smirk. And yet, Richard continued, the board has voted, narrowly, to extend an invitation to you. 4 games tonight, G30 time control. Scoring is 1 for a win, 0.5 for a draw, 0 for a loss. Only the highest totals advance to the final table tomorrow. Do you have a clock? Lila shook her head. Then you'll use mine. He reached into the velvet-lined case beside him and withdrew an antique wooden chess clock, its brass dials polished to a mirror shine. He set it gently on the table in front of her. This clock has timed every championship we've held since 1958. Consider it an honor. Lila placed her hand on the clock, feeling the weight of history beneath her palm. Any questions? Richard asked. Just one, she said. When I win, what happens? A ripple of laughter, surprised, even admiring, moved through the room. If you win, Richard said slowly, you will earn the right to stay, to play here as an equal. But if you win decisively, if you defeat everyone we put in front of you, then we will have no choice but to consider more permanent arrangements. He didn't say the word sponsorship, but it hung there, tantalizing. Edward drained his glass and set it down hard enough to make the crystal ring. Then let's make sure she doesn't get that far. The members began to disperse, the spell broken, the air buzzing with anticipation. Lila stood there for a long moment, staring at the clock, feeling the faint vibration of the ticking, even though it hadn't been wound yet. It wasn't just a game anymore. It never had been. This was Rosa's unfinished fight. And tomorrow night, under the bright lights of the tournament hall, she would either finish it or be erased. The tournament hall of the Grandview Chess Club had been transformed overnight. The Persian rugs were rolled back, the chandeliers dimmed to a soft golden glow that fell like stage lights over each board. Tables were draped in black velvet, each one crowned with a wooden chess set and a single ticking clock. Lila entered to a murmur that rolled through the room like the first distant rumble of thunder. She could feel their eyes, the members, the staff, the guests who had been invited to witness this spectacle. Some looked curious, some hostile, some even faintly thrilled, like spectators at an execution who secretly hoped for a miracle. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the hall, a conductor before his orchestra. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice calm but resonant. Tonight's Winter Invitational will proceed as always, except this year we welcome a most unusual participant. Miss Lila Monroe has agreed to play under our rules, on our terms. 4 games. G30, 1.50 scoring. Winners advance, losers are done. No second chances. He gestured toward Lila, and for a moment there was scattered applause, polite but cautious. Your first opponent, Richard continued, will be Mr. Theodore Banks. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. Banks was not just a member. He was a former club champion, a man with 30 years of experience behind the board. He approached with a heavy tread, his gold watch glinting under the lights, his expression somewhere between disdain and amusement. "So," he said as he sat down, "you're the girl everyone's whispering about." Lila said nothing. She took her seat, her legs barely brushing the edge of the chair, and set her hands on the table. "You know, child," Banks said as he began setting up the pieces, "this is a gentleman's club. You embarrass yourself here, and there won't be another club in this city that lets you in the door." Lila's dark eyes met his. "Then I guess I won't embarrass myself." A few spectators chuckled quietly. The clock was wound, the pieces aligned. Richard gave a nod. "Play." Banks opened confidently with e4, his hand steady. Lila countered with c5, the Sicilian defense. A few of the stronger players in the audience raised their eyebrows at the choice. Aggressive, risky. Banks smirked. "Sicilian, huh? Bold for a beginner." "She's no beginner," Harrison Vale murmured from the back, but no one seemed to hear him. For the first 10 moves, Banks played briskly, almost lazily, clearly expecting an easy victory. He castled kingside, developed his bishops, launched his knight toward the center. Lila, calm as stone, responded with precision. Not just book moves, but small, subtle improvements. By move 15, the tone of the game had shifted. Banks frowned slightly, leaning closer to the board. His central pawn was under pressure, his king's safety less certain. "She's playing a Najdorf structure," one of the spectators whispered. Banks pushed a pawn aggressively, trying to break open the queen side. Lila didn't flinch. She sacrificed her bishop on bxg5, and a collective gasp ran through the room. "Blunder," someone muttered. But 3 moves later, the trap was revealed. Her knight leapt into the attack, her rook slid to the open file, and suddenly Banks's king was under siege. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. The confidence in his face cracked. Lila sat perfectly still, her small hands folded on her lap whenever it wasn't her move, her breathing slow and even. She was no longer a girl playing for a meal. She was a blade being drawn from its sheath. The room had gone quiet except for the click of the clock. Banks's hand trembled as he tried to defend, his pieces retreating square by square until there was nowhere left to run. "Checkmate," Lila said softly, almost kindly. Banks stared at the board as though it had betrayed him. His king lay helpless, boxed in by her rooks, her queen a single move from deliverance. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the clock sounded deafening. Then slowly, Banks extended his hand. "Good game," he said, his voice rough but not without respect. Lila shook his hand firmly, her face calm, though her pulse roared in her ears. Around the hall, the mood shifted, slightly, but perceptibly. A few heads nodded. Harrison Vale allowed himself the faintest smile. Even Richard's expression softened by a degree. But Edward Crane, standing in the corner with his arms folded, only narrowed his eyes. "1 down," he murmured to Beatrice. 3 to go. She won't last. Lila rose from the table, her legs steady now, her fear burned away in the fire of victory. She glanced at the pairings board, where her next opponent's name was already posted. Margaret Sinclair, a calculating positional player known for strangling her opponents slowly until they suffocated. The room buzzed again, more animated now. The girl had won once. Could she do it again? Lila touched the edge of the clock one more time before stepping away. Rosa's words came back to her. Every move matters. Sacrifice if you must, but never stop moving forward. She didn't plan to, not tonight. The second game began under heavier silence than the first. The room was no longer curious. It was alert, almost reverent. The girl had proven she could win a tactical brawl. Now she would face Margaret Sinclair, the queen of quiet positions, the mistress of slow constriction. Margaret arrived like a chill wind, her cream-colored dress perfectly pressed, her silver hair pinned into place with diamond clips. She did not look at Lila as she sat down, merely placed her leather gloves on the table and began setting up the pieces with deliberate precision. "You play aggressively," Margaret said coolly as she adjusted the rooks. "That will not serve you here." Lila said nothing. Her heart was beating faster than it had in the first game, but her face remained unreadable. The clock was set. Richard gave a nod. Margaret opened with D4, a positional player's choice. Lila replied with NF6, quietly steering toward the king's Indian. The early moves were careful, almost gentle, like two fencers circling before the first strike. Margaret expanded her pawn center with E4, then C4, taking more space with each turn. Lila mirrored from a distance, her pawns coiled like springs, her bishops lurking in the shadows. By move 10, Margaret had built a perfect pawn chain, stretching from C4 to E4, dominating the center. The spectators murmured approvingly. "Textbook," someone whispered. Lila sat back slightly, feeling the weight pressing on her position. This was exactly Margaret's game, to make her opponent feel suffocated, to drain them of initiative, to win not by striking, but by letting them collapse under pressure. But Lila had been here before, on the streets, in the shelters, in classrooms where no one called on her because they thought she had nothing to say. She knew how to breathe even when the world was trying to crush her. On move 12, she played a quiet pawn push, H6. It seemed small, almost irrelevant, but it gave her bishop room to breathe, a tiny pocket of air in the darkness. Margaret's lips curved in the faintest smile. "A waiting move," she said softly. "How quaint." But Lila wasn't waiting. She was coiling. The game crept forward like a tightening noose. Margaret brought her queen to QD2, doubled her rooks, began the slow transfer of her knight to the king's side. Lila responded with patient, almost stubborn moves, defending, shuffling, letting her position simmer. By move 25, sweat dampened the back of her neck. Her pieces were cramped, her clock ticking dangerously low. The crowd could feel the tension, leaning closer to the board as if proximity would grant them insight. "She's lost," someone whispered near the fireplace. "Another 10 moves, and she'll be suffocated." But then, Lila struck. A pawn break on F5. It landed like a gunshot in the quiet hall. Margaret's eyes narrowed. The board cracked open, lines bursting to life, and suddenly Lila's once passive pieces were flooding forward. Knights leapt into outposts. Bishops cut across diagonals like lightning. The clock ticked mercilessly, but Lila moved with a strange, calm speed, as if she had seen this moment coming for 20 moves. Margaret tried to close the position again, but the damage was done. Her perfect pawn chain became a cage for her own king. Lila doubled her rooks on the file, her queen sliding into position like the last piece of a lock. And then, the brilliancy. A rook sacrifice on RF3. Gasps echoed around the room. Even Harrison Vale leaned forward, eyes shining. The sacrifice was sound, devastatingly so. If Margaret captured, mate would follow in 4 moves. If she declined, her position collapsed anyway. Margaret's hand hovered over the board, her face unreadable, then slowly withdrew. She played a quiet defensive move, but it was too late. Lila's queen invaded, the rooks crashed through, and the king was driven into a mating net as precise as clockwork. "Checkmate," Lila said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her ears. Margaret sat back, her pearl earrings catching the light. For a long moment, she simply regarded the board, then looked up at Lila. "You saw all of this 20 moves ago," she said quietly. "Yes," Lila replied. Margaret nodded once. Not quite approval, but something close. Then I have nothing more to teach you. She stood, smoothed her dress, and left the table without another word. The room erupted. Not in mockery this time, but in genuine applause. Not everyone joined, but enough that the sound filled the hall like the breaking of a storm. Edward Crane's face was like carved stone. 2 games, he muttered to Beatrice. If she wins again, we lose the narrative. She won't win the 3rd, Beatrice said, though her voice lacked conviction. Lila rose slowly from the table, her hands still tingling from the final moves. The pairings board showed her next opponent, Victor Hemsley, the oldest and most patient mind in the room, a positional genius with the kindness of a gentleman and the cruelty of a surgeon. The crowd pressed closer now, their skepticism turning into something else entirely. Anticipation. Lila touched the edge of the clock again, as if drawing strength from its steady ticking. 2 games down, 2 more to go. And somewhere she could almost feel Rose's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Victor Hemsley was already seated when Lila approached the board. He was a tall, thin man with white hair combed back so precisely it looked carved from marble. His 3-piece suit was perfectly pressed, his pocket watch gleaming in the soft chandelier light. Unlike Banks's bluster or Margaret's cold disdain, Victor radiated something more dangerous. Calm. "Miss Monroe," he said, rising just enough to offer a courteous nod. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Lila nodded slightly, unsure whether to speak. Victor's politeness was disarming, but something in his pale gray eyes put her on edge. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Let us play a proper game." The pieces were set. The room had grown hushed now, the spectators pressed in closer than ever. Even those who had mocked Lila on her first night now leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Victor opened with E4, classical and direct. Lila chose C5 again, the Sicilian. The first 10 moves were almost identical to her previous game, but Victor was not Margaret. He played faster, sharper, his pieces harmonizing like the chords of a practiced musician. By move 12, Lila was already on the defensive. Victor's pieces dominated the center, his knights leaping from square to square like trained hunters. Yet he smiled faintly, as if this was all simply a friendly exercise. "You have talent," he said softly, just loud enough for Lila to hear. "But talent is dangerous without structure. That is why children like you end up lost." Lila's grip on the knight tightened. "Children like me?" Victor's smile was kind, but his words were not. Alone, untrained, thinking the world is theirs to conquer, when the world has rules. You are a pawn that thinks it's already a queen. His bishop slid to BG5, pinning her knight. The crowd murmured in approval, a quiet positional squeeze that promised pain to come. Lila felt her chest tighten. She remembered the social worker who had told her almost the same thing. "You're clever, Lila, but clever isn't enough. Learn to follow the rules or you won't survive." Her clock ticked loudly, the sound magnified in her ears. Victor played with a patience that was almost cruel. Each of his moves quiet, suffocating, until her pieces seemed to have no room left to breathe. Then came the psychological blow. "Do you know what happens if you lose this match?" Victor asked conversationally as he slid his queen to QH5, threatening mate on H7. "The club will feed you your dinner, thank you for the entertainment, and send you back out into the snow." Lila swallowed hard. "If I lose, I'll play again next year." Victor's smile deepened. "If you survive the year." The room felt suddenly colder. Beatrice, standing near the door, allowed herself the smallest smirk. Lila looked at the board. Her king was cornered, her queen side undeveloped. She could defend, but it would only prolong the inevitable. And then she remembered Rosa's voice, soft but insistent. Sometimes, baby girl, you have to make the move that scares you most. That's the move that changes the game. Lila reached for a pawn, not a defensive pawn, but the G-pawn, and pushed it forward one square. The room gasped. Madness, someone whispered. She's weakening her king even more. But Victor hesitated. The pawn move had teeth. It challenged his bishop, created a potential counterattack, forced him to choose. He took almost 3 minutes before finally retreating the bishop, maintaining the bind but conceding a square. And that was all Lila needed. Her rook swung across the back rank. Her queen began to slip toward the center, and the position, still dangerous, still sharp, suddenly came alive with possibilities. Victor's face remained calm. But his fingers tapped once against the table, the only crack in his composure. For the next 15 moves, the game became a knife fight in a phone booth. Victor probed, feinted, tried to regain the initiative, but Lila's pieces moved like they were being pulled by unseen strings. Each move gave her just a little more space, a little more breath. Then, at move 33, the trap was sprung. Not by Victor, but by Lila. A knight sacrifice on NF5, blowing open the position. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Victor leaned back, studying the board. It was sound. If he captured, mate would come in 6 moves. If he declined, his king would remain under fire, his pawns shattered. He chose the lesser evil, but Lila was relentless. Her queen invaded, her rook followed, and within 5 moves, Victor was forced into a perpetual check, a draw by repetition. But in that draw, there was something far more powerful than defeat. Victor extended his hand, smiling for real this time. Well played, Miss Monroe. It seems you are no pawn after all. Lila shook his hand, feeling her breath steady again. She hadn't won, but she hadn't lost. She had survived. The spectators broke into applause, louder than before. Harrison Vale actually stepped forward, clapping slowly, his sharp eyes fixed on Lila with something like pride. But Edward Crane's jaw tightened. A draw is as good as a loss, he hissed to Beatrice. If she wins the last match, she still advances. We can't allow it. Beatrice's expression darkened. Then we change the rules. Lila left the table to a swirl of murmurs and whispers. Some people were already debating whether her draw against Victor was actually the most impressive result of the night. As she passed the pairings board, she saw the name of her final opponent. Harrison Vale. The man who had been watching her every game with the eyes of someone who saw further than the others. The man who had been smiling when no one else was. She felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. The last game was coming, and it would not just be a test of her chess. The main hall had grown so quiet that Lila could hear her own heartbeat. The pairings board still glowed under the chandelier. Harrison Vale versus Lila Monroe. He was already there, waiting for her. The man who had watched every one of her games, who had smiled when others scoffed, who had said nothing when Edward Crane muttered that she would never last. Miss Monroe, Harrison said, rising to his full height, offering a formal bow. I've been waiting for this game all night. Lila sat down across from him, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Around them, members stood shoulder to shoulder. Even those who had left earlier had returned when word spread that the girl had drawn with Victor Hemsley. But there was something different about the room now, a subtle tension, like a storm gathering just beyond the windows. Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the air. For the 4th round this evening, he announced, gaze steady, the board has adopted a special resolution. No draw rule. A decisive result will determine who advances toward tomorrow's final table. A murmur swept through the crowd. Modified rules. No room for a draw. Harrison frowned. That was not part of the original agreement, Richard. Agreements evolve, Richard said evenly. His eyes flicked, just once, toward Edward and Beatrice lingering near the back. The club requires clarity tonight. Lila's pulse pounded. No draw meant no safety net. Either victory or the door. Harrison's gaze softened as he looked at her. Are you willing to play under these terms? Lila's throat felt dry, but she nodded. Yes. Then let's begin. The pieces were reset. The clock wound. Harrison opened with D4, the queen's pawn, slow and steady. Lila answered with NF6. Tonight, she would not play it safe. From the very first moves, the game was a duel of ideas. Harrison built a solid center. Lila struck back with precise counterplay, her pieces dancing just outside the reach of his control. Move after move, the tension mounted. Harrison's style was different from any opponent she had faced so far, patient but predatory. He gave her no easy targets, no careless weaknesses. By move 20, the position was balanced but razor-sharp. She's holding her own, someone whispered. More than that, Harrison said without looking up. She's threatening to take over. He moved a rook, calmly strengthening his back rank. Lila inhaled slowly and found the move Rosa would have loved, a pawn thrust on the king side, tearing open lines toward Harrison's king. Gasps rippled through the hall. Harrison's eyes flickered with surprise, then approval. Very well, he said quietly. Let's see if you can finish what you've started. What followed was no longer a chess game, but a battle fought in silence. Harrison counterattacked with everything he had, his queen sweeping across the board, his bishops cutting deep diagonals. Lila's clock ticked dangerously low. 2 minutes. 1:30. The room was holding its breath. Even Edward Crane was silent now, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of grim focus. Then came the move, the one that would be studied for years if anyone ever recorded this game. Lila sacrificed her queen. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Harrison leaned forward, examining the board with a look of deep concentration. The sacrifice was sound. If he captured, mate would follow in 4 moves. If he refused, his position would crumble under the pressure of her rooks and knight. You saw this 3 moves ago, he said quietly. Yes, Lila answered. He smiled, not mockery, but respect. Then you've earned this. He captured the queen. Lila's rook swept in with check. Her knight delivered the killing blow, and the room erupted as Harrison's king was forced into checkmate. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Harrison stood, turned to the room, and spoke clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you have witnessed a master class. Miss Monroe did not just win this game. She won every heart in this room. Applause broke out. Hesitant at first, then swelling until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. Richard Whitmore stepped forward, his face unreadable. Miss Monroe, he said, you have earned not only your membership but your place in the history of this club. Edward Crane looked away, his jaw tight. Whatever plans he and Beatrice had made had just collapsed under the weight of a single brilliancy. Lila sat back in her chair, her hands trembling now that the game was over. She felt no triumph, only relief, and something deeper. For the first time since Rosa's death, she felt that she was no longer alone. The final applause still echoed against the high ceilings when the last pieces were cleared from the board. The chandelier light seemed warmer now, softer, as though the entire club had exhaled together after holding its breath for hours. Harrison Vale placed the captured queen back in the center of the board, then turned to Richard Whitmore. "The girl has proven more than enough," he said simply. "Membership, sponsorship, whatever recognition we can give, she has earned it." Richard looked around at the faces of the members, searching for dissent. None came. Even Margaret Sinclair, who had been so quick to object to Lila's presence days ago, now looked contemplative, almost humbled. Edward Crane stood rigid by the fireplace, his face a mask of defeat. "This does not change the fact that the club's reputation—" "Oh, it changes everything," Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room. "Tonight, we saw genius walk through our door, and instead of turning her away, we witnessed her transform this club. You speak of reputation, Edward. Ours has been restored, not ruined." Beatrice, standing beside Edward, paled but said nothing. She had been part of the scheme to push Lila out, and now that scheme had been checkmated in front of every witness. Richard straightened, his commanding presence filling the hall. "Effective immediately, Lila Monroe will be made a provisional member of the Grandview Chess Club. Her training, education, and living expenses will be sponsored jointly by the club and private donors." He glanced to Eleanor, who nodded once. "Tonight, this institution reclaims what it was always meant to be, a place where brilliance is nurtured, wherever it is found." The announcement was met with applause, not the polite kind offered out of obligation, but the roaring kind that shakes walls and stirs the soul. Lila stood very still, the sound washing over her like a tide. Somewhere deep inside, a knot she had carried since Rosa's funeral began to loosen. After the hall cleared, Harrison found her sitting alone by the board, staring at the pieces as though trying to memorize the final position forever. "You played the game of your life tonight," he said quietly. Lila shook her head. "It didn't feel like just a game." "That's because it wasn't." Harrison pulled out a notebook, scribbled something, and handed her a card. "I'm entering you in the National Youth Championship. It's 3 weeks from now. If you accept, I'll train you every day until then. You have the chance to show the entire chess world what you showed us tonight." Lila traced the edges of the card with her thumb. 3 weeks. Rosa would have laughed. Jumping straight into the deep end, baby girl? Richard and Eleanor approached, their expressions gentler than she had ever seen them. Eleanor crouched slightly to meet Lila's eyes. "You won tonight," Eleanor said softly. "But more importantly, you stayed true to yourself. Would you like to come stay with us until the tournament? You deserve a home where you can sleep without fear." For a moment, Lila couldn't answer. Her chest ached with an emotion too big for words. Relief, maybe, or the strange weightlessness of finally belonging. "Yes," she said at last. Richard extended his hand. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow morning we begin the paperwork. You'll have a guardian, a tutor, and a path forward. No more running." As they walked toward the door, the snow outside had begun again, flakes catching in the glow of the street lamps. For the first time in years, the winter air didn't feel like a threat. Lila paused, looking back at the chessboard one last time. The pieces stood ready for a new game. "This isn't the end." "Is it?" she asked. "No," Harrison said with a smile. "It's just the opening." And as they stepped into the night, Lila felt something break open inside her. Not fear this time, but hope. The kind that burns bright enough to light the whole board. "Dear friend, thank you for staying with Lila's story until the very end. Tonight, you saw more than a chess game. You saw a girl rise from the cold streets to challenge power, to expose arrogance, and to remind all of us that brilliance can come from anywhere. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to rate it out of 10 in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you want to see Lila's next chapter, her training for the National Youth Championship, the battle's still ahead, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell icon, and share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. Because somewhere out there, another child is waiting at a closed door, holding a dream in their hands, and your click might just open that door for them.